Much like the NES, a lot of the Super Nintendo horror games weren't super scary, but they were kind of creepy in the way that they looked. So these are going to be more atmospheric horror games. Anyway, here are 10 spooky Super Nintendo games for Halloween. So we start off with Super Castlevania IV, or Castlevania IV as I call it. This is largely a remake of the first Castlevania game. It significantly improves on the original ideas from the NES game, and, the controls are a lot better, the graphics are better, the gameplay is better. This is another in a long line of Super Nintendo games that are just essentially remakes. They're not really remasters because they tend to change things around, but they are just overall better than the Nintendo counterparts. Konami gave you a lot more control over Simon Belmont in this game. You can whip in pretty much any direction you want. You have to swing using your whip every once in a while. It's a much bigger game. It's more cinematic than the NES games. Even if it does kind of rehash a lot of what was going on in the first game, it improves on all of that stuff. It's just a better game overall, and it's a really nice game to play on Halloween. Speaking of remakes of games on the SNES, we have Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Yes, I know that the original started off in the arcades before being ported to the NES, but basically the plot of the two games is really the same. And if I'm going to be honest, I prefer the Sega Genesis version to this one. Both of them are great, but I like the Sega Genesis version a little bit more. This game has 8 stages, which you have to beat twice in order to finish the game, which is just kind of standard for these games. I have no idea why Capcom does that. It's a little annoying at times, but it kind of works for these. I do like Super Ghouls and Ghosts a little bit more than the Nintendo version, mostly because, graphics, gameplay, and controls are all better than that game. Even if my preference is still for the Sega Genesis game. All 3 are very fun. They do take a little bit of time to get used to, but not that much. They're all really great games. Now with those 2 out of the way, we get into some of the really weird stuff. This is Mutant Chronicles Doom Troopers. This is weird. Just to say the very least about it, it's a very weird game. Think of it like an overly violent Contra if Contra wasn't all that hard. That's essentially what you have with Doom Troopers. So this game is based on a card game that is part of the Mutant Chronicles franchise, which includes a tabletop RPG, a few video games, a really frickin' weird movie that was on the Sci-Fi Channel back in the 2000s, and, the card game Doom Troopers. You are not alone if you haven't heard of all of this. I had no idea all of it existed when I started playing the game back in the 90s. I didn't even remember it until I watched a movie on the Sci-Fi Channel when I was in college, and I was like, oh, isn't that the video game that I played for a few minutes? It's a weird game, but a lot of fun. Blizzard made an action-adventure game called Blackthorn that pretty much plays like Prince of Persia. It's a weird game set on a strange world where you have 2 warring factions. One of them is a bunch of mutants, the other one is humans. The humans have essentially been beaten or just whatever. Anyway, it's essentially Prince of Persia in a dystopian future where you run around with a shotgun and you blast mutants. It's weird. It's a very strange game. It's a lot of fun. The story is overly complicated for what game that you're playing. It's really strange, and for some odd reason I like it, mostly for the atmosphere. It can be fun, but man is it strange. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a movie-based game that is an adaptation of a novel from the 1800s. This is way closer to the actual movie. The main character is Frankenstein's monster, not the actual doctor. You start off as the monster and you go around trying to get to Frankenstein. It's a weird game that also, again, plays a little bit like Prince of Persia, but if Prince of Persia was, not all that great, the game's fine, in all honesty, but it is kind of it's a weird thing to adapt, really. I would have expected this to be closer to Castlevania, something like Frankenstein's Monster Returns on the NES, but instead we have this. It looks really freaking creepy, but yeah, most people probably know this as Another World. I have no idea why the title was changed when it was released in North America, so this is Out of This World. This is a very unique game for the 1990s. It's more of a cinematic platformer. You play as a young scientist named Lester who's transported to an alien world after some kind of an accident. I mean, the guy doesn't even get superpowers out of this deal. It's kind of bullshit. Anyway, you have to escape with your alien buddy. And then you have to solve a bunch of puzzles, and like the other two entries on this list, it feels a little bit like Prince of Persia, but much more linear than that game. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is an arcade run-and-gun action game. It was published by Konami, but LucasArts actually developed it. It isn't particularly scary, but it's a very fun game where you run around blasting zombies and trying to save kind of stupid human beings. It can be a lot of fun. There are a ton of levels in this, and it's just awesome. I played this game a few times over the years. It's a lot of fun, especially if you have a friend, so you can just kind of laugh at all the craziness that's happening. But yeah, it is an arcade game, so don't take it too seriously. I really enjoy it, though. So this is the third game in the Gargoyles Quest series, which is a spin-off of Ghosts and Goblins. It stars the Red Demon character from the Ghosts and Goblins series. It's one of the few times I've seen something like that happen. It's kind of weird. But hey, this is a really awesome game. In Demon's Crest, you're trying to gather 6 magical stones. When all of these stones are combined, they form the Infinity Crest, and it grants you some power to conquer all the realms, or some such nonsense like that. There are 3 endings to this, and a secret ending, so that's kind of awesome. It's a side-scrolling action game where you're changing your character around so you can take on different demon forms. You'll need these in order to defeat the different bosses and everything. It's just a lot of fun. It also plays a little bit like Mega Man, if I'm being perfectly honest. I know that might sound weird to some people, but that's what I was thinking when I was playing it, because you're getting all these different powers as you go throughout the game. Okay, now we're back onto some weirdness. This is Musia, which is not the same as Musia. In fact, this game changed its name so it wouldn't get confused with a Sega Genesis game. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Anyway, this is a side-scrolling action game where you play as a spearman. During the localization process, the name was romanized, so yeah. It's weird. It's very, very weird. Anyway, the main character survives some battle that he was participating in. He's the only survivor of it. When he returns home, the village elder tells him that, a maiden was kidnapped, and she was taken to the abyss. And for some godforsaken reason, it's your job to go save her. So, yeah, there's that. I don't even really know if it's supposed to be, like, your wife or anything. It's just mentioned that it's a maiden. But hey, somebody's got to save her. So this is Nusforu. This is not something that I planned on doing, but in a game that I thought was going to be Castlevania, like a few others on this list, it turned out to be closer to Prince of Persia. I'm not really complaining. It's just kind of odd that, I find another game that plays an awful lot like Prince of Persia. Let me know if you've heard this story before. You play as a guy who needs to save his girlfriend from a vampire. You start in the dungeon and you work your way up to a tower where Nosferatu is, and then you have to defeat him. Almost exactly like you have to do in Prince of Persia, but you're not fighting a vampire. Anyway, that's the story. The gameplay is pretty good, and I do like the graphics. There are other games on the Super Nintendo that can be considered horror games. These are mostly just atmospheric games. I don't think there's anything that was released, at least in North America, that's really going to scare anybody. There were a few legitimate attempts at horror games that were released in Japan. Clock Tower is the one that I can think of. But for the most part, none of these are really going to scare you like some of the games on, the PS1, the Dreamcast, Saturn, even on the N64, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.